Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about the Dark Ages. We're going to wrap up the Dark Ages, also known as the early Middle Ages, and we're going to discuss a number of things tonight. So we're going to talk about how these Germanic warrior tribal cultures were Christianized, and we're going to talk about worship during this period. We're going to talk about a great renaissance of learning that happened in the last 100 or so years of this period. And then I'll throw in a couple of more case studies of people from this time. And some of the things are truly going to sound strange and foreign, which probably most of the things that you've heard since we started have. But you're going to hear some things that are going to sound strange to you. But that's okay. The past is a foreign country. And I just want to urge you again to just try to listen to that culture and humbly learn, and without judging them as wrong or stupid, because I truly believe that if we brought Gregory the Great here into our cultural river, he'd look around and he'd probably be tempted to say, what are they doing? Why are they don't even look or act like they're Christians. So the people we're going to talk about and that we have been talking about are an entirely different, what I've heard expressed as a cultural river. And the way they respond to that and the things that they say and the things that they do are utterly foreign to us. And we just have to try to understand and learn and be sympathetic. That's my motto. So we're going to move away from kings tonight and see what it was like for the life of the Christian people in these early Middle Ages. So these various Germanic tribes that took over the Roman Empire had codes of conduct completely different than the Greco-Roman world. They had their own distinct ideas of who the gods were and what the relationships between men and women were and what they were for. Marriage isn't even really a word that you could use with these tribal groups. In the tribal group, the primary social unit where you get your identity is your self-identity is from your tribe. And now for the church, we have an entirely different missional environment than we had in the Greco-Roman world. These tribal warriors, let me just say, not only is it very different from what we had in the Greco-Roman world, but it is extremely threatening, as maybe this picture will sort of give you the image of. So these tribal warriors slaughtered males, they raped women, they enslaved children. And it's hard for us to comprehend this rule by tribal force. But in the midst of this environment, the church goes on the offensive in terms of evangelism. We saw that a little bit last week, but we could say as a generalization that the mode of engagement of the church is characterized by active evangelism in this period. We looked at Gregory the Great last week and the missionaries that he sent north from Rome. And, maybe for all we know, his attitude was, if we don't evangelize and Christianize, we are wiped out. So it was truly almost a matter of survival. And this evangelism isn't something that you see back in the early church, in the imperial church after Constantine. Back then, evangelism meant pretty much nothing more than the emperor sending in some troops to destroy a pagan temple or whatever. So nothing like we're seeing in the Dark Ages in terms of mission and evangelism. And under Gregory the Great, this evangelism becomes a cross-cultural communication of the gospel. And the Protestant history books have criticized his methods, saying he just stuck Christian ideas onto pagan ideas. So for example, Christmas, that's just an imposition of a Christian idea onto a pagan one. And Easter, the same thing, the imposition of a Christian idea on a pagan idea. And Protestants tell the story of the Dark Ages as the Roman Church just asserting its authority over these pagan tribes. And that's true in part, it really is, but it doesn't tell the whole story of what happened. So Gregory and Boniface, that missionary to the Saxons that I mentioned last week, they were extraordinarily effective evangelists within the limitations of their culture. And we don't want to miss the fact that by 1050 AD, by the end of the Dark Ages, all of the barbarian tribes had been brought into the Christian faith. And what we mean by that is those tribal leaders had been baptized, and their tribal groups were brought in, and they were submitting to the rule of law. Those societies became literate, and their own intertribal warfare stopped, and they became more stable kingdoms, what we recognize as stable kingdoms, and who are in relationship and dialogue with the organized church. There truly may have been compromises and problems along the way, but it's really still like a miracle that this happened. In our society, we're just incredibly over-individualized, where we want to make sure every single person has their personal profession of faith. And from our cultural river, we can lose track of the fact, we can lose sight of the fact that of the impact of entire tribal groups turning from chaos and slaughter and rape and banditry to peace. So the coming of Christianity brought peace to this incredibly warring culture. And then the church proceeds to Christianize these tribal societies. And this is when we begin to see the theme that is going to be the theme for the rest of the Middle Ages. We see the theme developing that the organizing principle of the Middle Ages is the identification of the church with all of organized society. Okay. And as case studies of this Christianization, of this identification of the church with the whole of organized society, I want to look at two things tonight. One is the development of the church year, and also baptism. So the missionaries that Gregory the Great sent out, and other popes after him sent out, would write letters back asking questions. They'd run into situations and they'd write letters asking for help. And a lot of the questions, actually a lot of these letters remain, and their responses. So we have a tremendous historical record here. But it's interesting that a lot of the questions that these missionary monks asked in their letters back home were questions about sexual practice. So for instance, how long after childbirth should a husband and wife refrain from intercourse? These are the questions that the missionaries are asking the Pope. What course of action is open if a wife is permanently prevented by illness from engaging in sexual relations? How should you celebrate a wedding? Is sexual intercourse permissible on Sunday? And the most asked question was related to marriage, and that was, how many generations from a common relation can marriage take place? And they were asking this because incest was a huge problem. In these tribal cultures, marriage, if you want to call it that, is a transaction which involves the exchange of land and property. So if you marry one member of your tribal kinship group to another member of the same group, then it's extremely advantageous because you get to consolidate your lands and keep them in the family. But that led to all sorts of levels of incest. So all these questions are coming up over and over. And instead of just giving one-off answers, the church develops a framework for teaching a tribal culture how to live, how to Christianize the basic fabric, the regular practices of life. So Gregory the Great and this started with Gregory the Great, so that he gets all these pastoral letters and these detailed issues of sexual practice, and he writes back, and he's what he's doing in his responses is he's trying to get them to focus on time and not on the sexual questions. So that is, he's trying to get them to create in these cultures a framework for the Christian year, for the calendar, and he wants them to concentrate on giving people the festivals of Christmas and Easter. He wants to give time shape. And this is where we begin to see the Christian calendar, the Christian year. We begin to see the Romanization of the calendar, meaning the introduction of AD or Anno Domini, which is the idea of Christ being the beginning of time, or the beginning of time being Jesus. And the church is changing how these tribal cultures imagine time. And Gregory was, I think, wise in what he was doing here, because think about these tribal cultures. Their lifestyle was literally about battle and the attendant mark of conquest, which was the rape of the women of the tribe that you conquered. And so time in this culture has a shape that's defined by the immediate. In the heat of the battle, you're not thinking about tomorrow. And you can even frame the act of rape as a violent apprehending of the moment. So this violence and this extreme lust take away people's sense of time. It takes away their ability to wait, and instead of just seeking immediate gratification in the present. And they also were a revenge culture. So if something happened that you were offended, or a relative was killed or whatever, there was this immediate response in anger to get revenge. But in the Christian pattern that was developed in these cultures, that revenge pattern is broken. There's an introduction of law, and also this emphasis on the fact that justice is the Lord's, and the law is going to reflect the Lord's justice. So instead of taking immediate recourse in anger and rage, you allow a process to happen that involves waiting. So anyways, in this evangelistic culture, the church is discipling these tribal cultures in one way by creating the Christian year, where time itself has a framework of theological meaning. And the present moment is set in the chronology of the unfolding purposes of God, where there's a beginning and a middle and an end. And gradually building into the social imagination of these tribal cultures, the capacity to imagine something more than now, the capacity to imagine a future. So that this is the source of the fully developed Christian year. Okay. And the next thing that we're going to talk about are the fact that the sacraments are developing in this time as well. We have talked about baptism and Eucharist, but in this period, 7 sacraments are developing. And when we come out of the Dark Ages, we have those 7 established sacraments of the medieval church. And this incredible painting is an altarpiece that was painted in the 14th century. And it has, in the painting, there are the 7 sacraments represented. And I don't think that all Protestants could name all of them. So I'm just going to go around and point them out with my cursor. So down here on the bottom left is baptism, then confirmation, confession. In the middle here is Eucharist. Ordination of a priest, marriage, and last rites or extreme unction. And I want to talk about baptism tonight, because it's a totally different picture of baptism than the early church had. And I want to talk about some more about the Eucharist also when we get to worship in this time. But first, I want to say something about the concept of sacraments, because the understanding of this is completely foreign to most of us, especially those of us who've, from the cradle up have been Protestant. But I want us to be sympathetic to this and not ridicule it. And first of all, to understand that the sacraments were a form of teaching. They were actually the main form of teaching, of theological instruction in this early medieval period. And these ritual practices were ways of enacting theology with your body, and a way to teach a largely illiterate community. And I actually love that, an embodied way of discipling these tribal nations. And it's through these sacraments and practice that the people touch the church, for better or for worse, all through their lives. And as we move into next week, into the High Middle Ages, we're going to see that every single village in the whole of the Western region has a church, a massive construction project period. But in these churches, in these places, the rhythm of life was defined by the sacraments, which grew into the rhythm of the church year. And the sacraments and the church year are transformative for these cultures. So baptism. I'm going to talk about marriage quite a bit more when we get to that in the High Middle Ages. But baptism, so it was understood as indispensable for salvation. And this is different from the early church. So this idea actually came primarily from Augustine in the 400s. Remember, he was the man who I told you who wrote about he had a theology for every single thing you could possibly think of. But he wrote that sin had been passed down to us from Adam by birth. So we're lost and doomed from the moment of our birth. He called this original sin. And so baptism is the first sacrament you receive in your life. And over here on the right, this is a medieval baptismal font. And they were always located right by the door of the church. Not up by the front, always by the front. It's the first thing you run into when you walk into these churches. So that's the first sacrament you receive in life. And when you're baptized, you are changed. This is a very important concept for the sacraments that are developing, that they actually affect a change. And so when you're baptized, you are changed into a member of the household of God. And it's largely of infants at this time because of this belief in original sin. And dying before you're baptized doomed you. And the sacrament actually changed you. It wasn't just a symbol. So by the baptism, you were, as an infant, given the grace of God to cover over that original sin. And also you became a member of the household of God. And so your unit of belonging is no longer this tribal group any longer. And it's not even really your immediate family. Your unit of belonging is the church. So baptism is about creating members of the church, of society, of something bigger than your tribe. Godparents would be there. And this is not a new thing, the concept of godparents, but they were very crucial at this early time, even more than your natural parents who were still being discipled out of their tribal pagan ways. So the godparents were responsible, along with the clergy, for educating the child in the faith. And this was at a time when the natural parents, like I said, might not have known enough to do that training, as this whole culture is being discipled out of their old ways. So if baptism was the point at which you received the grace of God for salvation of the sin you were born with, and it makes you a member of the household of God, of society, then baptism was a big deal. And baptism was understood as so important that stillborn babies were taken to sanctuaries where they were believed to come alive, just long enough to receive baptism. And special provisions had to be made in every parish if the priest had to go someplace. There needed to be someone covering, because you never knew when someone was going to actually go into labor, and you'd be needed right there for the baptism. So again, baptism was for salvation and for entry into the church, and actually considered entry into society. As we see the central theme of the Middle Ages, which I've already mentioned, but I'll say it again, the whole of medieval society, we're developing this idea of the identification of the church with the whole of medieval society. So entry into the church meant entry into society. And this is going to have implications down the line when we think about people who live in these lands who aren't baptized, who are Jewish or whatever. There's going to be a bias against them as not actually belonging to society. So now I'd like to spend a few minutes considering the worship service by the end of the 8th century. Okay, now the aspects of early church worship were there, but they had become more formal, and there was an increasingly important role for the priest, and there was more uniformity. In the early church, each church kind of did with the basic elements, they had their own approaches, but by this time, things are getting much more uniform church to church. And it came to be called the Mass. And this is a word that came from the Latin sentence that they would say when the service was over and you were dismissed. They would say, "Ite missa est," or go, "It's time for dismissal," or "It is ascending." So that word missa evolved into the word Mass, which is what the service would be called. So in the Mass, they would sing the Gloria Patri and the Lord have mercy, and various singings and various speaking, and it was all spoken and sung in Latin. Then there'd be an Old Testament reading, and there'd be a choir responding to the reading. There'd be a gospel reading, and then some words about the gospel reading. And then they'd set up the table for the Eucharist. Once the table was set, the people would bring up their offerings and put them on the table, and there would be an offertory prayer. And then the priest would lift up the bread and the chalice of wine and say prayers, and the people would recite the Lord's Prayer. The choir would sing a psalm. And while this is going on, the singing and whatever, the bread had to be broken because there were many loaves of it. And I've got a photograph up here, obviously not from the Middle Ages. Those are real hands of a photograph. But just to demonstrate that it was still loaves of bread that were broken into small pieces. It wasn't the wafer yet, as is used in the Catholic Church these days. And it was actually kind of hard to find an image that didn't look like the priest was holding up a wafer. But in this period, that wasn't the case. It was still bread broken up into pieces. So the priest eats the bread and drinks the wine first. Then the people come forward, the men first and then the women, and they take the bread in their hands and they drink, sip some wine from the chalice. Not everyone receives the Eucharist, because by this time it was expected that there would be a considerable amount of prayer and fasting before you took the Eucharist. And as we move through the centuries in the Middle Ages, it eventually lay people's participation in the Eucharist gets reserved actually just for the feast days like Christmas and Easter and Pentecost. So after everyone who is going to has partaken, they the table is put in order, the priest washes his hands and offers a prayer of thanksgiving, and then the deacons dismiss the people by saying that sentence, ite missa est. Okay, it's time for the dismissal. So what I notice here is there's more ornate detail in the ceremony, but it remains basically a community service of worship. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the Eucharist, what that bread and wine mean in this time period. By this time, most everyone was believing that the bread and the wine were the body and blood of Jesus. Now, if you go back to the writings of the early church, 100 to 500, and you look at the people who are writing about theology back then, you'll find some of them that are talking about the bread and the wine as symbols. Some of them are talking about it as the real presence of Jesus. And some, even within the same author, sometimes he'll say it's symbolic and other times he'll say it's real presence. So there was a lot of ambiguity about it in the early church, but by these early Middle Ages, we see them moving more clearly to a stated belief that it was the real body and blood. And interestingly, I don't know if you remember, but last week when I mentioned the sacramentaries, those books with the liturgy in it that Charlemagne had produced and standardized, Charlemagne insisted on the real presence in the bread and the wine. And an official doctrine of the church wasn't established until the 11th century. So we're going to talk about that more in our next section when we get to the High Middle Ages worship. So one more thing about worship in these early Middle Ages related to music. So this was the time when the Gregorian Chant was developed. And it's named after Gregory the Great because apparently Gregory the Great loved music, but it was actually developed a century or so after him. So Gregory was in the 600s, and this came more like in the 700s into the 800s. Now I don't know anything about musical theory, but I do know that these chants are sung in unison. There's no harmony. It's just pure melody, and it's not even a regular rhythm. It's just very mysterious sounding, just prayerful and just pure melody. And the important thing was the text. They were actually chanting the words of the Mass. They were chanting the Psalms. They were chanting other parts of the worship, other texts of the worship. And it really was sung prayer. It was also important in the monasteries. They used the Gregorian chant in their prayer and their worship and during their set hours of prayer during the course of the day. It's actually also one of the earliest forms of music that we have written down. It's just beautiful. I love it. It's just so mysterious, and it gives you just this sense of your soul rising up to God. So I thought I would give you 30 seconds of it. I could listen to those all day. Sometimes I do. All right, so that's worship. Before we leave the late Middle Ages, I need to go back to Charlemagne. We talked a lot about Charlemagne last week, but I have some more to say about him. So he was a paradox, truly. He was a man capable of ruthless rule, but he was also a man of devout piety. He was a warrior, but he also fostered scholarship and learning. And here's where we're faced with somebody who's floating around on a different cultural river than us. Just trying to understand Charlemagne is a challenge. But he actually transformed education. And during his reign and his son's reign, there was this period of increased cultural activity known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne himself had strong intellectual interests. He loved history. He was good at languages. He was naturally gifted at mathematics. That's quite a span. He particularly liked astronomy, but he never learned how to write. And it wasn't for want of trying, because apparently he kept a wax tablet under his pillow that he would take out when he was alone at night and practice. But in these early Middle Ages, after the fall of Rome and the time of the Germanic warriors and invasions and all that chaos, education wasn't very highly valued like it had been in the Roman Empire. Boys of nobility would probably get some kind of rudimentary education, but they probably get more sword play and military tactics than anything else. Even the priests and monks got only a basic education. And Boniface, that missionary to the Germans, once complained that he heard a priest baptize a person in nomine patria et filia et spiritus sanctus, which roughly translated means in the name of the fatherland and the daughter and the Holy Spirit. Well, all this changed with Charlemagne. He ushered in a cultural revolution with educational reforms at the core. And these reforms were going to influence Christendom or continental Europe for centuries. It started with his own household, his own children and himself. He wanted learning for himself and his family. And in his travels, he met a monk from Northumbria, which was northern England. He met a man named Alcuin. This is Charlemagne on the throne, and this is Alcuin in the white robe here. He's a monk. And he was an Anglo-Saxon Christian who was also an excellent scholar, clergyman, poet, teacher. And remember that tradition of learning and literacy that had developed in Ireland and that they had carried into northern England. And in northern England, there also a rich intellectual Christian tradition had also developed. So Charlemagne invited Alcuin to bring that tradition of literacy and learning to his Frankish kingdom. So Charlemagne envisioned these schools in his kingdom. He envisioned monks in training, meditating on reliable copies of the Bible. He envisioned his palace with libraries full of books of Christian doctrine and theology. And he envisioned a class of people who would be literate and be able to preserve laws and histories and read and write. Well, Alcuin wasn't that thrilled at first by the invitation to come all that way and go help Charlemagne with his ambitions. But eventually, almost reluctantly, he did go to Charlemagne's court, and he ended up in the land of the Franks for the rest of his life. And he was the biggest contributor to this revival of learning. So here's a summary of the transformation, this intellectual explosion. So first of all, Charlemagne issued an edict to the bishops and the abbots to begin educating young boys in reading, writing, Bible, theology, grammar, and educate them for service to the monasteries and make those monasteries centers of education. And then 10 years later, he ordered the priests and the monks to provide education to all of the children in their districts, even sometimes to girls. So education is slowly becoming available to a wider audience than just the elite. And these reforms also established accuracy and uniformity in the texts that are being studied. So Alcuin had a big role here. So all of these texts, the Bible, all these texts had to be copied by hand, and monks could get careless, sloppy, make mistakes, add their own things in. But Alcuin was responsible for getting raising the level of quality and standardization of these texts. And he had a really big role in getting to the text of the Latin Bible, a standardized text of the Latin Bible. So just quickly, the themes of this. So the importance of the value of the written word, the spread of literacy, the standardized learning. Also this emerging of, in education, emerging of religious and secular. So they would study the Bible and all kinds of religious texts, but they'd also study Greek and Roman philosophy. They'd study the Germanic legends. So this combining of all kinds of knowledge, and that is going to have a huge influence for centuries. And one last outcome of the Carolingian Renaissance. This is Alcuin again, that Anglo-Saxon monk. He created a new kind of handwriting. Did you know that you could do that? He created a new kind of handwriting called Carolingian Minuscule script. And for the first time, we have capital letters and spaces between words. They become standard features of writing, making it much easier to write and to read. So that's something that came down to us from the Carolingian Renaissance. Just a couple more images here. So these ivory carvings on the right here, there are lots of these that survive from this time period. That was a very popular form of art, ivory carvings. And then I just like this image because on the left from this period, because it's just sort of feels like in between. It feels in between ancient and the High Middle Ages classical kind of imagery that we recognize. It's just an in-between time. So the Carolingian Renaissance stalled a generation later after Charlemagne because his kingdom was divided among his grandsons. There was no strong ruler anymore. Rulers started fighting and vying for power. And so all of this, advancement in learning just kind of didn't go any further. But this was really a brief shining moment in this medieval Europe and kicked off by this semi-literate king, Charlemagne, this king of the Franks. But the influence of the Carolingian Renaissance is going to be felt 400 years later in the intellectual revival of the High Middle Ages. And it's going to be felt 700 years later when we get to the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I'd like to end with one more case study. And this is a woman near the end of this time period. So she's in the 900s, or excuse me, the 800, yeah, the 900s, sorry. And one thing unique about this choice for case study is that she is from the Germanic lands. And this is where just a few centuries before the missionaries met savage warrior tribes. And now this is what it's like in these Germanic lands that have become completely Christianized. And we've met Roman people, we've met Celtic people, we've met Anglo-Saxon people, and now this is a Germanic Christian. Her name is Hrosvit, and she's a secular canonist living in an abbey, which means that, so she lived in an abbey under the authority of the abbess, the head of the nuns, and she vowed celibacy and obedience, but not poverty. So that meant she could own property and she could leave the abbey, come and go, which the nuns couldn't. And this woman was a pioneer. So she is the first known Christian writer of plays. And her dramas are the only dramas that were composed in all of Europe from the 4th to the 11th centuries. She's also the first Saxon poet and the first female historian from north of the Alps. Her pen, Hrosvit, is a pen name, and it means loud voice, which I love. So in the abbey, she had access to libraries and teachers. And one of the authors that she read was a playwright from Rome from about 200 years before the time of Christ, a playwright by the name of Terence, and he wrote comedies. And Hrosvit read him, but she objected to his plays and how popular they had been because they depicted, quote, lascivious pagan women frolicking in the pleasures of the flesh. So Hrosvit wanted to compose dramas and substitute in a different kind of heroine. And she used Christian virgins who were firmly resisting the advances of lascivious pagan men, and that these Christian virgins were triumphant with Christ's help, and that was her dramatic intent. And she also wrote history and poetry. But another interesting thing about her work is, in general, it all centers largely around the experience of women, and so it's a great source of knowledge of the experience of women in this time. And her works after her death were largely ignored and lost. I'm not sure why. It was because she was a woman, but they were lost. But they were rediscovered in about 1500 by a German scholar who made them available for posterity. So Hrosvit, and that's the abbey in Germany where she would have lived. As we come to the close of these early Middle Ages, it's about 1000. What do we see? So the Germanic tribes, those warrior Germanic tribes that crushed the Western Roman Empire, they have been by and large Christianized. The church has become more and more identified with the whole of organized society. Churches have a standard liturgy of the Mass, and they have the 7 sacraments. The office of the Pope is for real. The throne and the altar are allied in this idea of Christendom. We can now speak of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. Unfortunately, at this time, the popes, remember in that alliance, the throne had the greater weight. The throne was the one in power. And so the popes and the church leaders in this time were actually appointed by nobility, by rulers, secular rulers, and they became actually their playthings. And the nobles, as they're vying for power after Charlemagne is gone, their nobles are trying to put in popes and church leaders that are on their side, and it just became very corrupt and a very bad time for the life of the church. It actually was so bad at this time that it's amazing that the Pope, the office of the papacy, actually survived, but it did. Don't lose hope about the church. It's interesting. You've got the people on the ground being very pious, and the church rulers and leaders really being corrupted by this alliance with the throne. But don't lose hope. We're going to see some amazing revivals and renewal movements as we move out of the Dark Ages. We're going to see renewals in the monasteries, renewals in the papacy and the church leadership. We're going to see this deeply pious spirituality of the lay people. So that's all coming. And we've covered the Dark Ages.